Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Crossings online service. My name is Andrew, and I am so glad you're joining with us today. Now, in 1952, Florence Chadwick, widely regarded as one of the best female swimmers of all time, set out to be the first woman to swim from Catalina Island to the coast of California. Now, this swim is no joke. It was 26 miles. The water was freezing cold. The waves crash against you, and of course, you always have to be on the lookout for sharks. But Florence Chadwick was an amazing swimmer, so she set out. Now, fast forward 14 hours into the swim, a thick fog rolled in to the point where Florence could barely see in front of her. In fact, the only thing she could see was her friend in this little boat near her who was there in case she wanted to give up or was in fact attacked by a shark. So Florence continued on. Now, at hour 15, she was exhausted. She was bitterly cold, and she couldn't see, again, more than a few feet in front of her because of that fog. And it was at this moment she would later recall that there was this little voice inside of her that said, "This is too tough. You can't see, it's too cold, the waves are too strong against you." That little voice became louder and louder inside of her head that said, "Give up. You'll never make it." But still, Florence pressed on until hour 16, where she called over the boat, climbed up the ladder, and collapsed on the deck. You see, at hour 16, Florence gave up. And as she lay on the deck of the boat, the fog eventually lifted, and she realized that she gave up 800 yards from shore. 800 yards away from her goal. Now, the next day, she was interviewed about what happened, and here's all that she could say. "All I could see was the fog. If I could have just seen the shore, I would have made it." I read that heartbreaking quote, and I think to myself, man, if only Florence had a guide. If only she had someone who was in her ear, cheering her on, saying, "You can make it, you can do it, you're so close. Don't give up." Everything would have been different for her. No one doubts Florence could have swam that last half mile to shore if only she had a guide. You see, life is better with a guide. I don't know about you, but I have personally never swam anywhere close to 26 miles. But I can think of plenty of moments where I'm exhausted, where I feel the waves of life crashing against me, where I am in this fog and don't know where to go or what to do next. And what I most need in those moments is a guide. You see, a guide is someone who knows where you are going. A guide is someone who knows the path you are on. A guide knows the obstacles you will face, and a guide leads you to the place you need to go. You see, all of us go through life in need of a guide. And maybe you're in that spot right now. Maybe you are a new parent and you got this adorable, precious baby at home, but this baby never sleeps, never eats. It is the most colicky baby on the planet. And you wonder how you're going to make it through one more week. Or you've been looking for a job in this season. It's been so tough because every single door has been closed. Every opportunity has fallen through. You feel like you are trying so hard, but it's like Florence. The waves of life are just pushing against you. You feel like you're in a fog right now and you're trying to figure out what to do next. You see, all of us need a guide, someone to lead us, someone to guide us through the struggles and complexity of the season of life we are in. Now, on a personal note, I know what it feels like to need a guide. Some of you know I grew up without a dad, and now I'm the dad of two boys. And I am fully aware of the fact that I have no idea what I'm doing as a dad. In fact, sometimes I'll tell my kids, I'll be like, "Hey boys, guess what? I don't know what I'm doing. I need a guide in this area of my life." Or I was thinking this past week, it is almost exactly 6 years ago that I stepped into the lead pastor role of this church, The Crossing. You see, I took over for an amazing leader and pastor who I so admire. You see, to take over for someone who has made such a difference in our community is a huge challenge. And on top of that, 1 year into me taking over, COVID hit. To say the least, with that was a season of challenge. And then right after that, the 2020 election hit. Now, the last few years for our church, specifically over the last 2 years, our church is growing like crazy to the point where every single week we hit a new attendance record, meaning more and more people are coming to faith. More and more people are getting baptized. More and more people are finding hope in Jesus. And all of this is so good. It's so amazing. But I'll be honest, with all these people comes challenges. And every week I am now leading a church that's bigger than anything I've ever led before. And just like Florence, I can learn, I can train, I can grow, I can put in all the work. But at the end of the day, what I need, what all of us need in life is a guide. Now, today we are wrapping up our series on the Book of Ruth. And what I've loved in this series is what we've learned is the Book of Ruth is a story of ordinary people who face everyday challenges with extraordinary courage. You see, every week we have been looking at one of the three main characters of the Book of Ruth. Week 1, we met Naomi. She leaves her home, her faith, her community. She leaves Bethlehem and moves to Moab. Moab is a place of darkness. And in Moab, tragedy strikes. Her husband and her sons die. And so eventually she decides it's time to return home. It's time to not just go back to Bethlehem, but go back to God. And then week 2, we meet Ruth, the Moabite, the daughter-in-law of Naomi, who risks everything she has and goes to Israel with Naomi. Then week 3, Nicole taught us on one of my favorite characters in the entire Bible. We meet Boaz, a man of strength and character, a man who walks humbly before God. And each week, we've seen how these everyday people, how their story is our story. You see, Naomi is the one who is returning to God. Ruth is the one who is discovering God. And Boaz is the one who is walking with God. And I'll tell you, watching today, some of you, if you were to describe the season of life that you're in, you've made some mistakes. You have regret. And like Naomi, right now you are in the process of returning to God. You're in a season where you are experiencing how God can forgive, how God still loves you in spite of that. Others of you are new to faith. And in this season, you are discovering that God isn't this distant figure up in heaven, but how God comes close to us, how he loves us, how he offers us hope. And then, of course, some of you are in a journey where you are growing like crazy in your faith. You are walking with God. And if you've read the Book of Ruth, you know these three are the main characters of the book. Except today, there is one final character that we need to look at. One final character that is at work behind the scenes in the Book of Ruth. And this one character is also at work behind the scenes of your life as well. So today, as we wrap up our series on everyday people, today we are going to be looking at the God who guides. Because all of us go through life in need of a guide. When it comes to our faith, if you've been around church, you see what happens at church all the time is we'll hear stories, these great stories of people like Moses. See, Moses is headed to work one day and he sees this burning bush and God speaks to Moses through this burning bush. Or later on in the Bible, there's this man named Saul and he's on a road and all of a sudden he is blinded and God speaks through this booming, thunderous voice to Saul. You see, these are just a couple of amazing stories. These are powerful stories. These are true stories. And there is so much that we could learn from these stories. And I don't know about you, but I've never heard God speak this way to me. I've never been headed to work and had God speak to me through a burning bush. Or I've never been driving down the 405 and instantly go blind and hear God speak to me in a thunderous voice. You see, God can and does speak to people occasionally in these spectacular ways. But today I want to focus on, in the remainder of our time, how God can guide us every single day. How does God guide every day? How does God guide us through the everyday challenges that you and I will face? If you are stuck in a dead-end job today and you're wondering, do I keep going in this job or do I maybe go back to school and get a degree? You want to know, how does God guide? If you just moved to a new city and you're wondering, how on earth do I meet new people, make friends? How do I make this new place feel like home? Today, I know you're asking the question, how does God guide? And here's the good news. The good news is we find the answer right here in the Book of Ruth. You see, God guides through three primary ways. And I want to encourage you to write these down. First, God guides through the circumstances we encounter. A couple of weeks ago, when we started this series, we unpacked the story of Naomi and Ruth moving back from Moab to Israel. And you see, when they arrive, Ruth goes out to get a job. And she ends up in this field, and there is this little sentence in the Book of Ruth that we can go right past it if we're not careful. Here's what it says. Ruth chapter 2, verse 3. It says, as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, Boaz is what is known as a guardian redeemer. And Nicole mentioned this last week. Back then, a guardian redeemer was someone who has the power to protect and provide for the family of a widow. Meaning, of all the cities in Israel, of all the fields that Ruth could just show up to work, she just happens to stumble upon the field of the one person who can provide and protect her. Now, you and I can read that and think, oh, how lucky Ruth ended up at the field of Boaz. What a coincidence. But it doesn't stop there. Verse 4, it says, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. Boaz now just happens to arrive at the field the same moment Ruth is there. He just happens to see Ruth and just happens to ask someone who knows Ruth's story. Now, again, you can read this as a lucky break for Ruth and Naomi. But here's what I found. What looks like coincidence is almost always God's guidance. I mentioned a few weeks ago that there is this home our church funds in Cambodia that provides a safe place for kids who are at risk for being trafficked. Well, just one random Sunday a few months ago, we just happened to do an update on this home. We talked about with our church how things were going, the difference this home was making in the community where it's located in Cambodia. Well, the weekend we showed this video, in the second row of our church was a guy, David, who had never, and I'm telling you, never been to church in his entire life. Not just like our church, but he had never been to a church. Well, he came that day because he was invited. And he showed up, not really expecting anything. But then all of a sudden, we started playing that video. And it just so happens that David's parents grew up in Cambodia before moving to the U.S. So as a kid, David heard all these stories about Cambodia. So Cambodia has this very special place in his heart. So here he is. He's watching this video update. And he can't take his eyes off the screen because he's thinking, what are the odds that the first time I ever show up to a church, it's a church that is investing in a place I love? I mean, what a coincidence that this church, of all the places we could be involved, and of all the weekends he could have shown up, what are the odds that this is the week he chose? It just so happens it's the weekend we show this video that he shows up to church. And I'll tell you, after the service, he came up to me and he told me his story. And I told him what I'll tell all of you. It wasn't a coincidence and it wasn't luck what was happening that day. It was God in his goodness guiding him to this place. You see, God brought him here to our church for a reason. And I'll tell you what, David, he kept coming. And then one day God moved in his heart and he said yes to the love and grace and forgiveness Jesus offers. And then a couple of weeks later, he invited his family to attend his baptism. And that week, his entire family showed up for baptism. Like his entire huge family. Here's a picture of all of them. You know, I think about that moment from time to time where David got baptized, because for me, it was a reminder that there are no coincidences with God. God worked in the exact way, at the exact time, in the exact moment David needed to hear his voice. And I'll tell you, for some of you, that might be you today. Maybe someone today sent you this link or asked you to watch this video with them, and you're not a churchy person, but maybe even right now something is happening inside of you. Maybe God is moving. I'll tell you this right here, that feeling you have, that's God's provision in your life. God is moving. So today I want to encourage you. Be on the lookout for moments in your life like this. Maybe you had a new neighbor move in, and maybe you've just been thinking to yourself, I should go over and introduce myself. Well, you should do that because it's not a coincidence they just moved in. Or maybe you got a friend and you think, I should invite them to church. I think they'd enjoy it. Maybe God will use that moment and that thought. When God gives you a little nudge, no matter how small, it's so important we respond because there are no coincidences with God. Now, that's not all. The second way that God guides us, everyday people, God guides through the character we're developing. As the story of Ruth unfolds, what you see is a person who is in the process of developing a really strong character. You see, Ruth never takes shortcuts. She never chooses the easy way out. In fact, after Boaz meets Ruth and asks about her, here's what he says of her. He says, all the people of my town know that you, Ruth, are a woman of noble character. You see, Boaz, in the entire town, they see the character of Ruth. That when Ruth faced life's hardest moments, when she lost her husband, when she moved to a new place with a new language and customs, when Ruth was at her lowest point, Ruth showed great character. I mean, you think about Ruth. For most of the book, the only family Ruth has is her mother-in-law. Now, I'm a pastor, and I would never make a mother-in-law joke, but if the only person in your life that you're close to is your mother-in-law, you're in a tough place. You see, and what we find with Ruth is these difficult moments, they produce great character in her. You see, character, I had one pastor tell me years ago, character is who you are when no one is looking. Character is being the kind of person who does the right thing no matter who sees it. See, there's this question I sometimes ask myself when I need guidance. I'll ask myself, what would a person of great character choose in this moment? When someone says something about you that isn't true, how do you respond? Do you defend yourself, say something bad about them or others? Well, maybe you could start asking yourself, how would someone of great character respond in this moment? Or your boss asks you to do something that just blurs the line between right and wrong. Ask yourself, how would a person of great character respond? You see, it's so easy today to talk about character, but so hard to respond in tough moments with great character. I mean, even for me, it's easy for me to sit here and talk to this camera and talk to you and say things like, well, when someone wrongs you, you should forgive them. But I'll tell you, it's way harder for me to actually live this out in my everyday life. It's easy for me to preach a message about being present with your family, but my character is revealed in how I actually live that out with my family. In fact, a while back, I came across some research done on speeches and sermons. By the end of day one of hearing a speech or sermon, most people will have forgotten 50% of what is talked about. By tomorrow, you'll only remember 25% of what is said. And then by next week, only 10%. Now, that is why next week I plan on preaching this exact same sermon, because you won't remember anything I said. In fact, odds are the only thing you will remember of this message is me saying that you'll only remember 10% of this message. You see, character is not formed in listening to speeches or sermons. Character is formed when God guides us into tough decisions where we can build character or take an easier way out. Okay, one more. God guides through the courage we show. There will be some times where God puts us in a moment where we have the opportunity to show great courage. We see this all throughout the story of Ruth. Naomi has to leave Moab and return to her people to be with her God. Ruth has the courage to risk everything and go with Naomi. Boaz has the courage to step up and provide for a family in need. And God uses the courage of these ordinary people to do extraordinary things. In fact, by the end of the book of Ruth, Ruth and Boaz have fallen in love. They get married, and then we find in chapter 4 of Ruth, it says this is Ruth, she gave birth to a son. Now the women of the town, they said to Naomi, they say this to Naomi, the mother-in-law, they say, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer." They tell Naomi, look how God has provided and protected you. Yes, you suffered tragedy. Yes, you went through a dark time, but look how God showed up. Look how God was still faithful. You didn't always see him, but he was always working behind the scenes. He was always guiding. And then we find in verse 17, they named this child, they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now David would become a great king in Israel. He would be known as a man after God's own heart. He would lead his people in worshiping God. But that's not all. In the book of Matthew, the biography of Jesus, we begin with this genealogy of Jesus, something that almost anyone, when they open the Bible, they skip. But right there in the genealogy, we find that Salmon was the father of Boaz, who was the mother of Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. Now, fast forward to the end of the genealogy and hang with me through all the names. We find that Mathan was the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Now, the word Messiah simply means Savior. And so what we find is that these ordinary people, Ruth and Boaz, because they said yes to the moments God tried to guide them, because they act out with courage and character, God writes them into the story of salvation, the story of his goodness and grace. You see, what we find in the book of Ruth is the courage you show today will bring about God's grace to people tomorrow. You see, Boaz and Ruth, they have no idea that their actions are going to be part of God's plan for the entire earth. That Boaz and Ruth, they have no idea how many lives will be changed by the decisions they make. They don't know, but God does. So today, if you're facing something that feels a little scary, that feels a little too big for you to handle by yourself, I just want you to hear me say, good, because odds are this is exactly where God is guiding you. Now, I want to wrap up today, and I want to talk about a way that I believe God is actually guiding our church and us as a church. Now, I know many of you watching don't live in Orange County, but I want to talk about what God is doing right here in our community. See, almost a year ago, our teaching team decided that we would spend the month of September walking through the Book of Ruth. And I'll tell you that back then we had no idea what would be going on in our church or in our world when we felt led to preach through the Book of Ruth. But here's the cool thing. God guides. And I'll tell you, over the last few months, our leadership has been looking at what God is doing in our church. And I mentioned this earlier today, but our church is experiencing some unbelievable growth, which is especially exciting when you realize that our church is reaching people who, for the most part, have never been to church, or they've left their church or faith background, or they believe that a church would never accept them. In fact, we have 40% more people sitting in our auditorium every weekend right now than we did a year ago. That means right now we have way more kids than we did a year ago. We have way more students, way more people in groups, way more people experiencing the life-changing ways of Jesus. And all of this is such unbelievably good news. You see, Jesus himself said, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." But it also means all of this growth, all of these good God moments, it's stretching our capacity here on our campus. It's tougher to get in and out of our campus and find parking. We have less optimal seats every week than we need. Our kids' space is being maxed out. And so our leadership team has been praying for God's guidance in this season. You see, we know it's not a coincidence that we are growing. We know that this is God moving in our community. So we, as a church, we had two options. We could keep doing what we're doing and try to just squeeze more and more people in every weekend, which would be fine. Or we could step out in faith. We could take a risk. We could do something courageous. We could add a service. And so we thought, and we prayed, and we strategized, and we became convinced that God was guiding us as a church to add a third Sunday morning service. Now, this is a big decision for us as a church, and it's way bigger than just a simple time change. You see, to add a service, it involves a lot, especially since we want to make sure that every single service allows us to have the same great kids ministry, the same experience for every new person who shows up on our campus, the same welcoming atmosphere that sets our church apart. In fact, for us to add a service, we are going to need 100 more people to volunteer at our church. That is a big number. On top of that, it's going to cost us more financially. More people add more wear and tear to our campus. Our kids and students are going to need more. The other day, I realized, oh my gosh, we have like 1 million signs we're going to have to change. I mean, next time you come on our campus, look at all the signage. All of that will need to change. It's going to require a lot of us. It's a big faith decision to step up with courage. But we want room here on our campus for your family and your friends. We want you to have an easy time parking and getting in and out of our campus. So we believe God is at work, God is guiding, God is moving, and our responsibility is to say yes, to act with courage. So starting in January, not today, but starting the very first week of January, we are going to be launching a third service. Our new service times are going to be 9 a.m., 10:30, and 12 on Sunday. Now, there's a lot of factors and reasons to go into what we're doing and why. In fact, over the next 2 weeks on our campus and then through email, we're going to do a short family meeting after our services. And we're going to get into some of the details and answer some of your questions with regards to moving to 3 services. So if you could be on campus, I want to encourage you to be there. But if you can't, send me an email at andrew@thecrossing.com, and I'd love to send you a video of that meeting. Now, I tell you all of this because as a church, we don't just talk to you about how God guides you. We live it out for ourselves. And as I've been studying the Book of Ruth, what I've held on to is that the courage we show today will bring God's grace to people tomorrow. And I believe that this was true for Ruth and Boaz, and it is true for every single one of us today. So, my hope for each of us today, my hope for our community, is that as we go throughout our everyday lives, we see how God guides. We respond to how God guides. And we experience his goodness and grace. Let's pray. God, we come before you and we say thank you. We thank you that this little book of Ruth is more than just a story of people on the other side of the world, but it actually happens to be our story. And so, God, as we face challenges, let us face them with extraordinary courage, because we know we have a God who guides. And so, God, today, we ask you to lead us. We ask you to lead us individually. For those of us who have never experienced your love and forgiveness, God, use this moment to guide us to your Son, Jesus, who gave his life for each one of us. God, as a church, as we step out in faith in this season, God, guide us to respond with courage and conviction and trust in your guidance. We love you, God. And we pray this in your Son's name. Amen.